Good evening. This is your host, Dan Zupansky, for the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history and the authors that have written about them. My special guest this evening is an author named Cathys Scott. This is her sixth true crime book. Her most recent is on St. Martin's Press. This one being a Penguin book. This is called The Rough Guide to True Crime, Organized Crime, Serial Killers, and Expert Psychological Profiles. Welcome to the program, and thank you very much for this interview, Cathys Scott.
Well, thank you. Happy to be here.
Thank you very much. Let me just give for our audience a little bit of the contents of your book, and then we'll go through some of the really fascinating stuff that you've compiled in this Rough Guide to True Crime.
Okay.
The first part of the contents start with Outlaws, The Money or Your Life, including Billy the Kid, John Dillinger, Pretty Boy Floyd. Oh, pardon me. Yes, Outlaws, The Money or Your Life. Billy the Kid, John Dillinger, Pretty Boy Floyd, Babyface Nelson, Bonnie and Clyde, and Ma Barker. The next section is Heists and Robberies, Art Theft, Diamonds and Pearls, Cat Burglars, and Lone Wolves. The next section is Kidnapped, White Collar Crime, Deception, The Art of the Con. Next section is Homicide, Unsolved Murders, including Lizzie Borden and Jimmy Hoffa. Next section, and in that as well under Homicide, is Women Who Kill, including Betty Broderick, which we'll be talking about today a little bit. Murder in the Media, The Trials of O.J. Simpson. And also under Homicide, Offspring Who Kill, such as the Menendez brothers trial. The next section is Serial Killers, including Son of Sam, David Berkowitz, Jerome Henry Brudos, Jeffrey Dahmer, John Glover, the Granny Killer, Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, Richard The Iceman Kuklinski, the Green River Killer Gary Ridgway, Dr. Harold Shipman, Doctor of Death, and the Yorkshire Ripper. She also includes another section called Organized Crime, the U.S. Mob, Al Capone and the Chicago Outfit, John Gotti and the Gambino family, the Lucchese family. The next section is Organized Crime Worldwide, Asian Gangs, Yakuza, Triads, and Big Circle Boys. Also includes Pablo Escobar and the Medellin Cartel, the Russian Mafia, and street gangs, Los Angeles street gangs, Bloods and Crips, and criminal tattoos, gangs of New York, Westies, Black Spades, and Latin Kings. And she includes another section called Dirty Cops and Bad Apples, the LAPD, the beating of Rodney King, the New York City Police Department, Mafia Cops, Louis Eppolito and Stephen Caracappa. And she also includes in her last section lesser violations, celebrity misdemeanors, obscenity, blasphemy, and free speech, including the Larry Flint story, and also absurd laws, and another section called cyber crime. So that is an amazing compilation of true crime.
That's my most lengthy book thus far. It was 135,000 words. So.
Right. Now, how long did it take you to do this project specifically from beginning to end, and how many years did it take?
Well, probably about a year. I was actually working on another book at the time when my agent at the time came to me and said Penguin had contacted him and they were looking for an author. I think one had fallen through or something, and did he have any authors who could pull it out? In other words, somebody who could stick to it and get it done, because it was a lengthy book. And so the good thing is I didn't have to do a book proposal, and then I got together with the editor, and we went back and forth, and he had a proposal, and he had my books, and that sort of thing, and they chose me, and it was like giving birth to a baby. I mean, it was all of that is sort of a fog right now because I was doing two books at the same time. So, but I'm really proud of it. I sweated through this and learned a lot about some stories I didn't know about. What I tried to do, one thing, is to try to take a different angle with a lot of these stories, because so much has been written about a lot of the cases, so, and there's some funny things in it as well.
Okay, well, tell us what number one, maybe what your criteria was for picking the stories, specifically that would be included in the book, and then give us that, what was your twist? What was your angle that you approached the writing of this or the presenting of these same, maybe even familiar stories differently? What was your approach?
Well, one thing I always try to do is to write about the underdog. That's always, even with the Tupac Shakur case, because he was murdered, and nobody seems to be solving the crime. To me, he's an underdog, and so I do, I do go after that sort of thing, and I'm trying to think of a case that Bertha Pippin is one murder case, and this was a family in Oklahoma, and her son who happened to find her body. And this was an elderly woman. I mean, she was in her 80s. It was very, very sad. And two teenagers in the neighborhood who'd she given odd jobs to and that sort of thing, murdered her over something like $3 and beat her with a baseball bat. It's really horrible. And very, very little was written about that case. I mean, it barely was a blip, on the radar. And I found it because I knew somebody who knew the family, and so I went after that. Took quite a bit to get the old articles and stuff because there wasn't anything available. And then I interviewed the son, Jerry Pippin, who happens to be a radio guy, and it was a fascinating case. And what I wanted to do was kind of give Bertha Pippin a voice. She went out like a light, so sad, and I just wanted to give her a voice. A lot of times when you write about murder, it's the last time these people are ever going to be written about, because not everybody who's murdered is famous. And so I always take it sort of personally and try to give them a voice.
Certainly. So what you mean by underdog as well is that you're taking low-profile cases or no-profile cases and then taking those stories, finding out as much as you can.
And telling people about them. And I think that, and I'm really a person for detail. I mean, I'm working on a case right now, Barbara Cogan out of New York, and I just landed some documents from court that are like a Christmas present to me when I get things like that. And I just love the details, and I pour through them and the documents and to find the details. And so that's what I try to do, is kind of tell the reader different things, relevant details, of course, and something maybe they didn't know before. I think that some of these, I spent a lot of time, for example, in New Orleans, after Hurricane Katrina, because I was down there for a rescue group, an animal rescue group, and ended up writing Paw Prints of Katrina, a book about it, which was in-depth, reporting, because I had to follow the animals from beginning to end. Okay. And being down there, I know what the New Orleans Police Department is, and I know they're trying to clean up and change their image. But I did cover the New Orleans Police Department in this book too. I have a personal interest in it. So some of it was, personal, some of it wasn't, And I think people ought to know, when you're going to a city that, like New Orleans, it's not as safe necessarily as you think it is. But I love that city, so at the same time, I'm not going to, write anything to try to hurt them, but I do write the truth.
Sure. Well, that's journalism, right?
Yeah. So. Yep.
Well, let's get
journalists first. So.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's evident with the book that you've put together here.
Thank you.
Let's get back to that. Let's start with some of the cases that may be more interesting to our audience, and my audience is, as the title of the program is, the most shocking killers in true crime history. And despite you having some less violent crime, we'll say, and non-serious crime would be better described. Non-serious crime. Yes,
there's some serious crime in here. There's some serious crime in it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's all serious crime, but there is some stuff that isn't.
There's some big ones in here. Yeah, we tried to balance it with kind of off the wall, but there are some big cases in here.
Sure.
Eaton Pats is one, and then the the Betty Broderick case is an interesting one. In the women who kill category, she was the one who sort of stood out from the other cases in that section, because they were either battered wives or or had very mean husbands, and she was a socialite in La Jolla.
Okay, well let's get back to that just in a little bit. I just want to go back to a little bit in the beginning. I'm really fascinated with, and I know that some people too that are true crime fans are more current history, maybe the 70s or everything from In Cold Blood. But we've had this same psychopathic killer amongst us for many more years than just the last 40 or 50. And you talk specifically about some of these characters, Billy the Kid, Ma Barker, and Bonnie and Clyde, some of the gangsters, and some of the outlaws from the Old West.
Yeah.
Maybe you can tell us about a couple of the people from the Old West that, or maybe even one person from the Old West that really, the story really resonated with you, and you felt it necessary to put in your true crime compilation. Tell us a little bit about one of those stories.
Well, I think that everybody knows, Billy the Kid and John Dillinger and Pretty Boy Floyd. He was a pretty dark. He was a pretty dark character. The thing about these, like Bonnie and Clyde and Floyd and those guys and Babyface Nelson, they, it was a different time in America, and when there was it was fairly easy apparently to just go in and rob a bank, and these guys were actually, they became famous by the news stories that would be written about them. I don't think we had true crime books back then, did we, per se? And they, right. And they actually, there would be people who would give them a home for the night, or feed them, or, egg them on, because it was, I don't know, it was almost like living vicariously through them, and they were, for the most part, pretty big bad guys. But, Ma Barker and those guys, I mean, that was a dysfunctional family, and her boys, and she claimed she didn't know what they were doing, and of course she did, but they just moved from city to city, and her boys robbed banks. But I think that's I think that was an interesting case to kind of look at Ma Barker, because the boys are written about, her sons are written about a lot, but not necessarily her. And I think the things that have been written about her weren't, there's nothing glorious about what they did, and nothing glamorous about what they did. These people could barely eat sometimes because they couldn't go anywhere, they couldn't be seen. And I think Bonnie and Clyde, I mean, these guys are all, they're part of lore, but Bonnie and Clyde too, I think that was really an interesting case, kind of looking at their story. And what I did was I went way back to how they met. They met at a friend's house. Okay. And she was just a teenager, and I think it's interesting just to kind of go back into the history and kind of give more than just the standard fare of what you're used to hearing about those cases.
Well, what was unusual about their teenage life that you thought maybe was a precursor to some of the crimes they did later, or you thought, geez, that's unusual that they may have led a life of crime because of their ordinary, we'll say, teenage life?
Well, I think that it was the times. I mean, she was helping a friend do housework, or helping a neighbor or whatever, and there wasn't an opportunity. Excuse me, there wasn't an opportunity for women back then other than to meet a man and marry him. And then she met Clyde, and he was an out for her, and she hooked up with him, and he was an out for her, and she got to leave the life that she was in. And so I think in some cases women hooked up with men back then just to get them out of the situation they were in and get them out of the town they lived in. And I think that was the case here. And then but I think there was a real attraction between the two, and she didn't quite know who he was. She didn't know he was an outlaw when she hooked up with him. She could have left any time she wanted to, so there are those photos of her holding a rifle and smiling and that sort of thing, so she was a part of it. I mean, the women who hook up with these guys, they pretty much know what they're doing.
Well, I was going to say, as you were starting to say, I thought, well, geez, these people, there's always been people that are attracted by the dark side.
Yeah.
And you throw in romance and good looks. I mean, I think the media has always played a big part in this. You say, well, there probably weren't true crime books in those days. Probably not per se, but the newspapers were the medium, and people, it was well read, and they were always sensationalistic, and they were always looking for interesting characters, and I think the media's fascination with this has just been reflective of people's fascination with the criminal mind, because it is so deviant and so out of the ordinary compared to the way we may think. And some of it, when people are robbing a bank, I can see where some of that, there wouldn't be so much distaste for that type of crime as opposed to some of the serial killers and lust and torture killers and baby kidnappers, and so.
Yeah. Well, but, I think it's, people always say, crime has become more violent. It's always been violent. I mean, they thought nothing back then of just blowing somebody's head off, and then it would get headlines, and the guys were, they were outlaws on the run and sort of, made to be heroes in a lot of ways. But I don't know that it's become any more violent. I think that we just have more of it because we have more people. And then we have other ways of hearing about it now too. I mean, the internet is incredible how you hear about things, and then of course there are the copycat crimes. But as a newspaper reporter, because I was one for a long time, the readers typically will say, can't you give us the good news? Well, it's not sexy, and people do give the good news, but crime sells. People want to read about it. And sometimes, like in this book, I write about kind of the dumb things people did too, and I'll never forget a cop telling me early in my career that, most of the crooks are stupid, that's why they get caught. And so you get to write about kind of the bungling burglaries too. And the FBI they egg it on a little bit, because of a lot of cities, the bureaus, when there's a bank robbery, the bureaus name them. Like there's the bad breath robber, and there's the, pretty face or the ponytail robber. They give them names. The pink shirt. I mean, whatever it is, they give them names, and they sort of help, kind of help sensationalize it a little bit themselves.
Now, speaking of people too, and you talk about the media naming say a bank robber, but they're more so apt to do that.
The FBI does that. The
FBI. Pardon me. Yeah, but. Well, the FBI, but media will also, in a different example, name specific serial murders, like the Green River Killer or the Zodiac, the Zodiac, that was his own name that he
but the media picks it up and carries it through, yeah.
And don't you think that's a certain feature that we didn't always have? I mean, Jack the Ripper, before the turn of the century, loved and reveled in his notoriety for the killings that he did, but it is... I mean, you've just said that you don't think crime is any more violent, but we do have a more recent phenomena since probably the 70s, which include some of the killers that we mentioned and that I wanted to talk about, and you've included in your book as well. Son of Sam, Jerome Henry Brudos, Jeffrey Dahmer, John Glover, Ted Kaczynski, Richard Kuklinski, Gary Ridgway. We have the whole palette of different types of serial killers, insane serial killers, psychopathic serial killers.
Well, they're all kind of crazy, aren't they?
Ted
Kaczynski, that's he's crazy as a loon. And then you look at some of them that are, the Jeffrey Dahmer case. I had a hard time even writing that. That's just such a dark story.
Absolutely.
The cannibalism and the, luring young guys into his place and his apartment, and some of them teenagers. It was horrible. Such a horrible, ghastly thing.
Well, the courts, part of his trial was whether he was insane or not. The courts deemed him sane, and he received a penitentiary sentence. But I think that I think a lot of people will look at the types of crimes and say that's insane. And of course,
well,
it would be
how
insane
he
to
went
us.
out. How
Certainly.
Sort of justice was served in that case.
Sure.
If it's looked at that way, was they had him in. He was in high security for his own safety.
Right.
Well, they lowered his security. And then a bunch of guys got him in the shower.
Well, he's one of the more reviled criminals ever, so I don't know if anyone was surprised.
Justice was served in that case. If anybody, wanted worse for him, you certainly got it. But, yeah, it is, and the laws are so, I think I think justice you sort of get justice by whatever, the attorneys are. I think that some are better than others, and it's I don't know if that's fair. You know what I mean? Because it depends on if somebody gets off. It's because they had a better attorney.
Well, wouldn't it be a much different situation if you had the means to afford your lawyers and had the means to hire the best lawyers, as opposed to being assigned a lawyer from the state itself?
I think so. And then it depends on the case too, and how good it is. The thing that they do today is they try so hard to just plead everybody out, instead of taking them all the way to trial. And I think that's a really typical thing. And I think some people plead guilty and they're not guilty. And we found that. We found that a lot. But and then other cases, the people they're not guilty and they're not, they don't have the funds to do it, and their attorneys are overloaded, because they're assigned and they can't keep up with the cases they have. So, but cases, most of them are guilty. So.
Well, the thing is I think you have a system where you have a few states where you will not have a review of the case before, say, a death penalty sentence is carried out. So you have that prospect of, that's, letting somebody out after a review after 10 or 15 years with a DNA review or something else came up in terms of new evidence. But if you do enact the death penalty, then you always have that problem.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll ask you this question here. Like I'm sitting in Canada, and I won't go into our Canadian politics and our judicial system, which is based on the same system as yours, which is a British system, and very similar to Australia and other jurisdictions in the world. However, there have been many changes, and it is almost night and day when we look at serious crime in terms of the sentencing, the way things are proceed in court in terms of conviction, plea bargaining. Just for example, first-degree and second-degree murder are tiered differently. Manslaughter only has one manslaughter designation. There's not degrees of manslaughter.
Yeah.
The rules
complicated, very complicated.
It's very complicated. We voted against the death penalty many years ago in Canada. So, I just asked you this question. I've asked my first two guests the same question. What is your opinion about the death penalty as a sentence in certain cases?
Well, like I just said, in the Dahmer case, he got a death sentence, and it was, inmates who did it. I'm not. I hate to come out of stance asking if I'm pro-life. You know what I mean? It's almost the same thing, and I like to kind of stay neutral as far as my opinions go and that sort of thing. But I do like to see justice meted out. I think it's kind of an antiquated way to handle a criminal, yet to kill them, yet our prisons are full of people. We're just overloaded with criminals, and we can't keep up with, housing them, and then and the way they're housed, and the recidivism is awful because they don't get a lot of rehab and, to prepare them for the outside world if they go out on parole. So I don't know. I think our justice system in a lot of ways is broken, especially now with DNA tests going back and getting people where DNA was preserved and the evidence did not point towards certain people, and they're released. They get another trial and they're released because they weren't guilty. I think that speaks volumes, too, about our judicial system. I think it's the criminal justice system is a little bit broken, don't you think?
Well, obviously the criminal justice system can't be perfect, but at the same time it's in response to, very, very serious criminals. We wouldn't, it's idealistic to talk like this, but there are serious criminals that cannot be dealt with in any other way except incarceration. And even then, some of these people have broken every taboo and every boundary of humanity known to man.
No, and you look at Manson. He's a case that's another dark case. But you look at Manson, and he didn't carry out the murders himself, but he had people do it. And talk about crazy. And I've watched some parole board meetings of his, hearings of his on TV, and it's creepy just looking at his eyes. and somebody like that is, I think they've got him more in general population right now too, and he's, should he have been killed? You know, I mean, it's, you know, he's going to stay there till he dies. You know, so I don't know. I don't know. It's an interesting subject.
Right. Now, you talked about, included in your book, a section on women who kill, and you said it would be interesting to talk about this because this woman does come up for a parole hearing in March of this year.
Well, she actually had it. They did it early.
Oh, they did? Okay.
Yep, they did it a few days
ago. Don't give it away. We'll talk about it. And you can tell. I think I know the answer here, and this is a story that a lot of people may have seen on American Justice. I know I've seen it, and it's riveting because they was televised the trial, and so they do have very good footage of the woman on the stand, and let's get to that, and we'll talk about that because that was just interesting that I had forgotten her last name anyway. So tell us a little bit about the Betty Broderick case.
Well, Betty was a socialite in La Jolla. I'm from San Diego. I have a cabin there, so I'll be there hopefully this year again, living there. But La Jolla is a very high-end community and expensive, and her husband was an attorney, and she helped put him through law school. And they had 4 children, and 2 boys and 2 older girls, and she remained a housewife and, you know, did everything for him. And then he hired a young attorney or a young assistant or whatever she was at his law firm and started having an affair with her, and then he dumped Betty. And for 8 years they tried to get a divorce, and he worked the court system, you know, his friends and whatnot. She couldn't get a fair attorney. He put very stringent rules on her. And, you know, she says he drove her crazy. I don't know if he did or not. You know, some people do very well, and, you know, if there aren't any problems and you throw a problem in and they can no longer function. And Betty seems to be one of those people. And she, early one morning, 8 years later, and she was living in La Jolla, he was giving her $16,000 a month, and that was 20 years ago, which wasn't a bad alimony pay.
But that was just till the divorce was
finalized, and she had an SUV and that sort of thing. And he paid for school. The kids went to private school, La Jolla Day School, and she early in the morning, before dawn, had taken her daughters, and he had custody of the kids too, partial custody. I mean, he had two of the kids, and
well, was that now how? Now,
the kids didn't want to be around her. All she did was trash their father.
Okay, no, but the thing is that's you got to go back a little bit further.
Okay.
There's a little bit of information that may have drove a woman over the edge. One thing is that he's having an affair with a younger woman, and she put him through college. The second thing is that now he's in the celebrity pages, the society pages that she felt was real important.
Well, she
now,
was
maybe
in
the
them too. Now she's in them. Yeah, she replaced her.
But the thing is, I think that it's fair to say that maybe part of it was that this custody battle with trying to take the children away from her, and maybe that. So go on.
Part of that was because Betty wouldn't let him see the kids, so he went to court, you know, or he'd come to pick up the kids, and they wouldn't be there.
Right.
She played as many games with him as he played with her. The two of them played sort of a cat and mouse game with each other, and in one case he came home late, and I think it was when she suspected he was having an affair, and he wasn't home yet, and so she took his very expensive Italian shoes and suits and everything, put them in a big pile, and she had a bonfire with the kids and burned all his clothes. And she did crazy stuff when they were still together, and she made it as difficult on him as he did on her. I mean, he contributed greatly to the dysfunctionality of their relationship. And the kids, the boys, they were younger, and one was 9 and one was 12. I think they wanted to live with their dad, you know, because mom was acting crazy.
Right.
And she was she was obsessed and wanted to know every detail of what he was doing, and the kids didn't. They were providing her with information, and they didn't want to do it anymore. She became an obsessed woman. She was driven, and it ended quite ugly.
So
you
tell
want
us
me to continue?
Yeah, sure. Tell us what happened here.
So what she did was she got into her daughter was the one was a teenager and the other was I think 18 or 19, and she got into her purse and got her father's front door key into the house in Mission Hills in San Diego, a high-end area as well. And early in the morning before the sun rose, she got into their house and went upstairs to the bedroom where Dan, her almost ex-husband, and he was her ex-husband at that point because this was his new wife. So she finally did get the divorce after 8 years. And she shot them. And she not only shot them while they were sleeping, but Dan was still alive, and Dan reached for the phone, and Betty went and yanked it out of the wall. So he was still moving and still alive, and she emptied the gun into both of them. And then she drove 15 minutes, 20 minutes to the beach. La Jolla sat and watched the ocean for a little bit, picked up a phone, and called Dan's best friend and said, I just shot Dan and Linda. Then she called her daughter Kim and very calmly said, I just shot your father.
Right.
Yeah. And that was how it went down. And then they used the defense of, she was driven to kill, but she says she went to the house and she never intended to kill them. She took a gun with her, and she did very early in the morning. She said she went to talk to Dan. I mean, she very quietly went up those stairs and opened fire on those two people. And it was he probably never figured she'd do something like that, but he did make it very, very difficult on her.
Now, you talk about having the defense that she was insane at the time or temporarily insane. It did result in a hung jury at first, so she did have some success with that. Did she testify at the first trial, or was it the second trial she testified at it? And give us a little bit of that, what happened when she did testify, and if that did help her or hurt her.
Well, she testified at both trials, and I believe she testified at the second trial, and she sounded more sane than she did the first time. But what she did during the first trial is she would get into this sort of screeching voice, and the assistant district attorney in San Diego was a woman, and I can't remember her name off the top of my head, but she went for first-degree murder, which, of course, is premeditated.
Right.
And it appears as if it was premeditated. I mean, all evidence points to it. But she went blow by blow. And this is a woman who's stuck and, couldn't get past things, obviously. She was talking about it then like it had just happened, the problems with Dan. She's a woman who was not living in the moment. And so she got up on the stand and just screeched and cried and literally sounded crazy. And but the way she was treated, it came across, I think there were some sympathizers, but she basically just sounded nuts and very self-serving. She didn't seem, in the way she treated her children and badgered them about their father, she justified in her own mind. I can't imagine those poor children, who are all grown now, but having to live that day after day, and that's what she concentrated on was their father. And so she still has no remorse. She showed no remorse on the stand and easily admitted to doing it and gave great description of how she did it. And then she went upstairs and all of a sudden, boom, the gun went off, like she didn't fire it. And the assistant DA tried to get her to admit to, well, you pointed it, you knew what you were doing, that sort of thing. She had a hard time in that first trial getting Betty to admit to specifics. And because it was a first-degree case, it was a hung jury. And she did go to second trial, and they went after a second-degree murder.
Yeah, so a little bit easier to achieve, and thusly they did, especially with her testimony.
It's a sad case. It's sad for, sad for Dan and Linda who were killed. It's sad for the kids who had to endure that for so many years. Then they lost both their parents. So it just was, it was sad all the way around. And Betty seems to have adjusted very, very well in prison, likes it. she's like the den mother, and she's older, and everybody comes to her, and she's very comfortable in that environment. So there have been stories about it. She's interviewed about it, and she did go up for parole.
And what happened?
They denied it. Yeah, and she basically was very calm when she was talking and that sort of thing, and didn't said that two lovely people are dead, and there were people who loved them. But she still didn't show any remorse. She didn't say she was sorry. You want to be paroled, you've got to say you're sorry. And
sure.
And she she seems a little unpredictable. Like I said, a woman like her needs everything neat and tidy, and something gets thrown out, and she can't adapt to it. I mean, she couldn't adjust to her husband leaving her. Lots of men go out on women, and the women don't go kill them, and he did prolong it for so long, but they both contributed to it. She wanted to agree to certain things. She wanted a lot of money, and he didn't want to give it to her, and so it went very, very badly.
So you're saying
but she does well in prison, and I think that's why, because it's she's got rules and regulations, and she operates very well in that environment.
Well, how old is Betty? And she still has other prospects of potential parole down the road.
Yeah, she comes up again in 15 years. I think she's around 61, 62, and she does come up again, but in 15 years. She got a sentence of something like 32 years to life, I believe.
Right.
So it's their option, and at the end of the 32 years, which she was, in her early 40s, late 30s, however old she was when it happened, and so she'll be much, much older, so she'll probably die in prison. Well, she'll be 75 when she comes up again. So
yeah.
Be interesting.
Most of her life.
Hard to let someone like her out, because what do they do? And she does seem to be doing well in prison.
Sure. Now you talked. You have a section called the Unsolved Murders in the Homicide section, and you include a story about Jimmy Hoffa. For our audience that may be younger or doesn't know about Jimmy Hoffa, give us a little bit about Jimmy Hoffa. And I know it's a legend, but nobody really seems to have specifics of what happened to Jimmy Hoffa, who he was.
Hoffa was the union leader. Let me go to that section real quick. Sorry.
Teamsters
Union. Thank you. And Al also had a relationship with the mafia, because the mob was all involved with the Teamsters for years. And and it is an unsolved murder. And there are rumors that he was buried inside a wall of one of the casinos here when it was built. But it's hard to solve mob related cases sometimes, but I think he in Hoffa's case there was a lot of controversy going and on at the time, and he ticked off a few people, and the word is it was the mafia that did it. But Meyer Lansky and all those guys, and the Italian mafia, but nobody will ever get to it for sure. It's one of those old mob stories, that it's the brotherhood, and they don't talk about, they don't admit anything,
Right.
But I do cover a new book where there was a low level criminal hanging out with those guys and with the union and the mafia and that sort of thing, very low level. And he claims that he helped kill him. And on his deathbed, he talked about it. So, whether it's true or not. And then he was buried out in a backyard of a house, and that house, the FBI 2 years ago went to it and dug up and everything, and never did find a body. But the book was Charles Brandt's book, I Heard You Painted Houses. And supposedly you go up to a mafia guy and say, when you want somebody killed, and you say, I heard you painted houses.
Okay.
And so it's kind of interesting. And so he he writes about a guy by the name of Sheehan, and he claims he was there when he was killed, and it was the mafia that did it. Whether it's true, we'll never know. And the guy on his deathbed told him this, so no skin off his nose.
Right. Now, of all the cases that you cover in this, and I mentioned a bunch of these cases, obviously, from organized crime to famous serial killers and even outlaws from the Old West. Now, what you had mentioned a couple names, Eaton Paths, you had mentioned, and the Chowchilla case. Tell us about these cases. I know we spoke just before the program. These are the kinds of cases, or these are cases specifically that you that are not so well known, and are cases that you really found interesting and really fit into this compilation that you put together, and you felt it necessary to put in there. Maybe you can
kind of off the wall, cases. The Chowchilla case. You want me to start with that?
Sure, go ahead. Okay,
the Chowchilla case was out of Central California, and it was a group of students out for the day to go swimming, and their driver's driving down a quiet highway, and they see somebody in trouble, and they stop, or the guy's barricading the street actually, and they stop, and they, some two guys get on the bus, take it over. They drive for a long time, and what the driver did was he paid attention to the distance and the sound of where he was going, and they drove for several hours, and then they drove the school bus into a hole in the ground, and then they buried it. And they put mattresses on top of they put mattresses inside for the kids to sleep on. And then they put and then the roof was covered in dirt. And they put something on the roof, but I can't remember what it was, and then they covered it in dirt, and then they put pipes down so the kids could breathe. So after several hours, they left them food and water too, and they were planning on doing a ransom, these two guys. Well, what they did was they had dug a hole on the property of a construction site that one of the guy's fathers owned. And they just thought they'd go ahead and they'd get ransom for these kids, and then it would all be over in 24 hours. And what the driver did was he took those mattresses that they gave him inside the bus, and he stacked them, and he pushed and pushed on the roof and kept taking whatever sharp thing he could do, and he busted through, and they merely climbed out and walked. And they walked out, and they went to a construction worker on the site who called the police. Everybody knew they were missing, but anyway, it was a stupid crime. And those guys got put away for, 21 kids. There's one count each. So they'll never see the light of day. And nobody got hurt, nobody was killed, and it just is a miracle, really, that they got out of there. And it was the driver, really, who saved them, because who knows how long they could have lasted down there. And then Eaton Pat's case is he's a Manhattan boy who was 6 years old, and for the first time walked from his walk-up apartment in Manhattan to the corner with his mother looking out the window, and he begged her that he wanted to go alone to school. And somebody grabbed him. And that is a case that they had, it was a kidnap case and a ransom, I believe, and it's unsolved, and it's just a very, very sad case. When you see cases like that, it's like a Lindbergh baby almost, but the Eaton Pat's case wasn't as famous, but it's just a sad story, a beautiful little boy, and the parents who had to deal with that.
Now, how many of these cases, obviously you had to do an incredible amount of research to put this book together. Were there cases that you were already familiar with that you just simply were able to include from your true crime research, the stories that you were familiar with? And what stories specifically were very surprising to you, and in doing this research and putting this book together? Which ones really stuck out at you, and you'd never done the research before, you weren't so familiar, but were quite interesting to you?
Well, I think there was a jewelry heist out of Europe was an interesting case because it was so orchestrated the way they planned it. I had no idea. I mean, you hear about the jewelry heists and you read a little bit about them, but the planning, the months and months of planning to go in and rob, the jewelry districts in Europe and or the jewelry district and go in and actually pull it off and wear black clothing and have vans waiting and that sort of thing and wiring and everything else they have to do to pull it off is pretty incredible. I didn't know that they were that sophisticated. That was one thing I learned in it. A case that I was very familiar with was the Tony Spilotro and the Hole in the Wall gang case. I covered Herbie Blitzstein. He was Tony Spilotro's right-hand man, and was his
Tell us about that, because I'm familiar with mobsters quite a bit, but tell us about this Hole in the Wall gang.
Well, they're Tony Spilotro was hooked up with the Italian mob here, the Chicago mob, and ran the skim, at some casinos, and
right.
and he was sort of being forced out, but not yet. And so what he did was he formed this Hole in the Wall gang, and what they would do is they would find out from their moles, like insurance agents, who had what in their houses. And like the Las Vegas Country Club, which you need a pass to get in there. I've got a friend who lives there, and they've got high-rises in there. They actually had their own, they rented a place there. And at one time, I think Tony Spilotro owned a house. So what they would do is there are houses there, and they're the high-rises, these huge skyscrapers and apartment buildings, and they would go in from either the outside door or a hole in the ceiling or whatever and drop in and take jewels and whatever the people had. And they would find out from maitre d's at restaurants, when they were coming and going, when they went to a restaurant, when they were on their way out, so they could get in and out very quickly.
Right.
And they did this right and left. It was pretty incredible. And they had 7 burglars or something, 8 burglars, and they'd have a lookout guy. And the lookout guy was a cop.
Okay.
Because they pulled in the
cops
too. So they, who would listen to the radio traffic, so they could tell who was coming, if any cops were coming or whatever. And they got caught in the middle of a heist, and it shut the whole thing down. But they had a jewelry store, and that's where they would fence everything from. And Herbie Blitzstein was an incredible fence. I mean, he could ship jewelry to Chicago and wherever else and get high numbers for them, for whatever they would take, and they'd just fence everything. And it was his side job, and the Chicago bosses told him to knock it off and not do it anymore, and he kept doing it. And then Tony was ending up in the papers a lot, and he ended up getting killed, in a cornfield actually, with his brother by the mob, which is those are unsolved murders as well. But everybody knows what happened basically. And then Herbie went to prison a year after Tony was killed, and Herbie Blitzstein. And when he got out in, I think it was 93 or whatever it was, he started fencing and set up his own fencing outfit, and doing insurance fraud and that sort of thing. And he hooked up with an Italian partner who did him in. And Herbie, I was at the scene of his crime, and that was about, I think Herbie was killed in 96. And weird case. And that never, 7 people were convicted in connection with this murder, but nobody was convicted of murder. And at the same time, here's an interesting side thing on it. At the same time as that, Oscar Goodman, who was a mob attorney, previous mob attorney and now mayor of Las Vegas, Oscar Goodman was running for office of mayor, and he gave a news conference in the middle of this mob trial. He gave a news conference saying that the mob has been out of Las Vegas since the early 1980s. And here we were in the middle of a mob trial. It was just, I guess if you say it, it makes it true. It was hilarious. Right. Yeah, and I wrote a story for Reuters about that, actually. But Herbie was, it was kind of a sad ending for him, if you can think of a sad ending for a guy. He's a nice guy. He didn't have any other trade. He wasn't a killer for the mob. He was a fence, and he was Jewish, so he couldn't be a maid. He wasn't a maid mobster. So he fenced, and he gets out of prison. That's my dog. And he gets out of prison, and his what's he going to do? He doesn't have any, his partners are all gone, and he doesn't have anything to do, so he starts up the rackets again and gets himself killed over it because he started mixing with the wrong people.
Yeah, sure.
So it's an interesting story. So I know that story well, and
well, it looks like we've have some technical difficulty here with Cathy going offline here for a second. We're nearing the end of our program anyway. You were listening to Cathy Scott with the Rough Guide to True Crime, Organized Crime, Serial Killers, and Expert Psychological Profiles. And that's a Penguin book, available just a couple years ago, I believe. I want to tell you about next week's program. My guest will be Nick Prawn, and he is a journalist with the Toronto Star for many, many years. And he was one of the few people that was a witness to the incredible trial of Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka in Toronto. And for those that don't know about Bernardo and Homolka, I suggest going to Crime Library and just getting a little bit of background on these people. It is one of the most sensational true crime stories ever. Obviously, some people in America aren't so familiar with the story, but I think true crime buffs definitely are. It's a real Barbie and Ken kind of story, a couple that most people would have never thought would be capable of anything like this, which included the rape and killing of their own sister, of Karla's sister, and the eventual plea bargain that was given by the Canadian government, negotiated by her lawyers. The Canadian judicial system gave her a plea bargain which ended up her originally going to be able to be out in 8 years, and then finally she was released in 12 years, to a lot of outrage and protest from the public, considering that her crimes were not really known when the deal was struck. There is an issue of videotapes of the torture and rape of certain victims that was discovered not by the police in their search, but actually by Paul Bernardo's lawyer, and that tape depicting Karla's contribution and participation in these heinous crimes, including her own sister, was withheld from the Canadian judicial system, and hence the deal was done before full disclosure of information was achieved. So it's a very, very interesting case. Don't let me get you with the impression that this is a real dry case and it's all about the law and it'll be very complicated. It is a fascinating case with all kinds of twists and turns, from the somewhat bungling police to the ego of separate police forces. This is the stuff that fiction is made, except fiction is never this horrifying by any means. Nick Prawn was privy to information that no one else had. There is really only 3 or 4 books on the subject, and Nick Prawn's is one of the best. It's called Lethal Marriage, Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka. In the following weeks, we have Catherine Casey, and she's going to be talking about her book, Descent into Hell. We're going to be privileged to have such prestigious guests as Philip Carlo, who did The Night Stalker, and also a book about Richard The Iceman Kuklinski. Really looking forward to interview with him. We have a fine journalist named Stevie Cameron, who was the journalist that covered the Robert Pickton trials in Vancouver. This is another incredible crime, another true crime historical footnote, the Robert Pickton murders. Incredible trial that still is in the appeal process, but Stevie Cameron has given us a wonderful book called The Pickton Files, and so we're going to have her on the show in the following weeks. Sue Russell, that's done Lethal Intent, about the woman, famous serial killer woman in the U.S., Aileen Wuornos. We are going to have a number of guests that are going to be talking about their incredible crimes. Everything that will be coming up in the near future, I will keep you posted. You've been listening to the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Join me every Wednesday at 8 p.m. Central Standard Time for this program, or anytime on demand in archives. Thank you very much for listening. I will talk to you next time. Good night.
It was 135,000 words, so.
Right. Now, how long did it take you to do this project specifically from beginning to end, and how many years did it take?
Well, probably about a year. I was actually working on another book at the time when my agent at the time came to me and said Penguin had contacted him and they were looking for an author. I think one had fallen through or something, and did he have any authors who could pull it out? In other words, somebody who could stick to it and get it done, because it was a lengthy book. And so the good thing is I didn't have to do a book proposal, and then I got together with the editor and we went back and forth, and he had a proposal, and he had my books, and that sort of thing, and they chose me, and it was like giving birth to a baby. I mean, it was all of that is sort of a fog right now because I was doing two books at the same time. So, but I'm really proud of it. I sweated through this and learned a lot about some stories I didn't know about. What I try to do, one thing, is to try to take a different angle with a lot of these stories, because so much has been written about a lot of the cases, so, and there's some funny things in it as well.
Okay, well, tell us what number one, maybe what your criteria was for picking the stories, specifically that would be included in the book, and then give us that, what was your twist? What was your angle that you approached the writing of this, or the presenting of these same, maybe even familiar stories differently? What was your approach?
Well, one thing I always try to do is
as well as that you're taking low-profile cases or no-profile cases, and then taking those stories, finding out as much as you can,
and telling people about them. And I think that and I'm really a person for detail. I mean, I'm working on a case right now, Barbara Cogan out of New York, and I just landed some documents from court that are like a Christmas present to me when I get things like that. And I just love the details, and I pour through them and the documents and to find the details. And so that's what I try to do, is kind of tell the reader different things, relevant details, of course, and something maybe they didn't know before. I think that some of these, I spent a lot of time, for example, in New Orleans, after Hurricane Katrina, because I was down there for a rescue group, an animal rescue group, and ended up writing Paw Prints of Katrina, a book about it, which was in-depth, reporting, because I had to follow the animals from beginning to end.
Okay.
And being down there, I know what the New Orleans Police Department is, and I know they're trying to clean up and change their image. But I did cover the New Orleans Police Department in this book too. I have a personal interest in it. So some of it was, personal, some of it wasn't, And I think people ought to know, when you're going to a city that, like New Orleans, it's not as safe necessarily as you think it is. But I love that city, so at the same time, I'm not going to, write anything to try to hurt them, but I do write the truth.
Sure. Well, that's journalism, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yep.
Well, let's get
journalists to write about the underdog. That's always, even with the Tupac Shakur case, because he was murdered, and nobody seems to be solving the crime. To me, he's an underdog, and so I do, I do go after that sort of thing, and I'm trying to think of a case that Bertha Pippin is one murder case, and this was a family in Oklahoma, and her son who happened to find her body, and this was an elderly woman. I mean, she was in her 80s. It was very, very sad, and two teenagers in the neighborhood who'd she given odd jobs to and that sort of thing, murdered her over something like $3, and beat her with a baseball bat. It's really horrible, and very, very little was written about that case. I mean, it barely was a blip, on the radar, and I found it because I knew somebody who knew the family, and so I went after that. Took quite a bit to get the old articles and stuff because there wasn't anything available. And then I interviewed the son, Jerry Pippin, who happens to be a radio guy, and it was a fascinating case. And what I wanted to do was kind of give Bertha Pippin a voice. You know, she went out like a light, so sad, and I just wanted to give her a voice. A lot of times when you write about murder, it's the last time these people are ever going to be written about because not everybody who's murdered is famous. And so I always take it sort of personally and try to give them a voice.
Certainly. So what you mean by underdog, the Menendez brothers trial. The next section is serial killers, including Son of Sam, David Berkowitz, Jerome Henry Brudos, Jeffrey Dahmer, John Glover, the Granny Killer, Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, Richard The Iceman Kuklinski, the Green River Killer Gary Ridgway, Dr. Harold Shipman, Doctor of Death, and the Yorkshire Ripper. She also includes another section called Organized Crime, the U.S. Mob, Al Capone and the Chicago Outfit, John Gotti and the Gambino family, the Lucchese family. The next section is Organized Crime Worldwide, Asian Gangs, Yakuza, Triads, and Big Circle Boys. Also includes Pablo Escobar and the Medellin Cartel, the Russian Mafia and street gangs, Los Angeles street gangs, Bloods and Crips, and criminal tattoos, gangs of New York, Westies, Black Spades, and Latin Kings. And she includes another section called Dirty Cops and Bad Apples, the LAPD, the beating of Rodney King, the New York City Police Department, Mafia Cops, Louis Eppolito and Stephen Caracappa. And she also includes in her last section lesser violations, celebrity misdemeanors, obscenity, blasphemy, and free speech, including the Larry Flint story, and also absurd laws, and another section called cyber crime. So that is an amazing compilation of true crime.
That's my most lengthy book thus far.
Good evening. This is your host, Dan Zupansky, for the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history and the authors that have written about them. My special guest this evening is an author named Cathys Scott. This is her sixth true crime book. Her most recent is on St. Martin's Press. This one being a Penguin book. This is called The Rough Guide to True Crime, Organized Crime, Serial Killers, and Expert Psychological Profiles. Welcome to the program, and thank you very much for this interview, Cathys Scott.
Well, thank you. Happy to be here.
Thank you very much. Let me just give for our audience a little bit of the contents of your book, and then we'll go through some of the really fascinating stuff that you've compiled in this Rough Guide to True Crime.
Okay.
The first part of the contents start with Outlaws, the Money or Your Life, including Billy the Kid, John Dillinger, Pretty Boy Floyd. Oh, pardon me. Yes, Outlaws, the Money or Your Life. Billy the Kid, John Dillinger, Pretty Boy Floyd, Babyface Nelson, Bonnie and Clyde, and Ma Barker. The next section is Heists and Robberies, Art Theft, Diamonds and Pearls, Cat Burglars, and Lone Wolves. The next section is Kidnapped, White Collar Crime, Deception, The Art of the Con. Next section is Homicide, Unsolved Murders, including Lizzie Borden and Jimmy Hoffa. Next section, and in that as well under Homicide, is Women Who Kill, including Betty Broderick, which we'll be talking about today a little bit, Murder in the Media, The Trials of O.J. Simpson, and also under Homicide, Offspring Who Kill, such as the